There he is. Make sure you unmute yourself, Steve.
There we go.
All
Okay.
right. There he
So I'm
is.
on my laptop monitor, my laptop camera here, so it's kind of looking up at my nose here. But
It's all right.
try to look down mostly.
Well, I know you have a bunch of visual slides, so I think everybody's gonna be more focused
Yeah,
on
this is a very visual presentation, so you probably don't have to look at my face at all.
that. All right. Well, we'll let you take it over.
Okay, just give me a second. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so the name of my talk is The Little Details of UI Design. And this talk is about some of the observations I've made when working closely with developers over the years. I often see the same mistakes being made when they're trying to design their own applications or even implementing designs that I've provided. And the thing is, most developers know what good design is when they see it, but they're just not sure how to get the same results as the work that inspires them. And then as a result, they resort to using component-based frameworks like Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap's a great starting point, especially if you're prototyping a simple app or need to get a basic setup really quickly. But it can also be really constraining if you want to produce like highly polished designs similar to that work that inspires you. So how do you get to that next level? Well, when you look at examples on sites like Dribble, it seems like such a huge leap to produce similar results. And I know that feeling, which is the feeling I had when I first started designing, that you just can't help but feel overwhelmed to the point where you don't even know where to start. But if you break it down and look really closely at some of these examples, you'll see that it's not such a huge leap after all, and it's just a bunch of little details. So for example, these designs, they're really similar. They almost look the same. They share the same layout and content, but the one on the right just looks a little more professional. And the difference between the two is just a few small changes. Now, this is just a really small example, but these are the types of changes that can make your design appear more trustworthy and are going to give your users more confidence when using your application. So for this talk, I want to show you how you can make these changes that will help improve the emotional experience of your design. But I'm going to do that with a much larger example. I'm going to be refactoring an app called Sneaked In. It's a social career app for sneaking. And I'm going to be starting with a design that looks like this. And while I refactor this design that's loaded with plenty of common mistakes I see developers make, I'm going to walk you through every step. And along the way, I'll be sure to share plenty of practical tips that you can apply to your own designs. But I also hope you'll learn a little bit about the process, where you can look for inspiration, as well as just the general workflow when refactoring your own apps. So there may be a few ideas here that are very specific to the UI I'm designing, but I hope by addressing a few of the specific things, it'll help you understand what goes through a designer's head when approaching visual design. Okay. So before we get started, let's just take a look at the layout we have here. We already have a decent layout to start off with. It's pretty similar to most social sites out there. The top bar, it mostly consists of a search input. And we have some notifications icons in the top right there. Down the left, we have our main navigation. We sort of have this activity panel there to display like various stats of the user. Down the middle, we have this news feed and posting functionality. And finally, on the right, we have like recommendations for the user, like who to follow or various jobs they might be qualified for. So to make this talk a little more digestible, I'm going to be addressing each of these sections one at a time. So let's start with the header. So as I just said, the top bar mostly consists of the search input and some notifications on the right there. And these are all pretty important. So we really want this top bar to stand out a bit on the page. And right now it's looking a bit bland. The dark gray doesn't have very much personality. So it might be nice to bring a splash of color into it. So one way we can do that is by just referencing the primary brand color that I have here. And that gives me an interesting result. It stands out and brings life to the page, but unfortunately it stands out a little too much. And plus this color might be, we might want to use this color later on for like a primary action or to bring attention to another section of the page. So instead of making the top bar the same color as the brand color, I can try using the current gray and just bringing a bit of the brand color into it a bit, just to make it a bit more interesting. So how can we do that? Well, let's take a closer look at the color we have here. When working with color on the web, we mostly define color with either a hex code or RGB values. But these concepts, they're not only difficult to understand, but the values have no correlation with one another. So if you're using like a red hex code and a yellow hex code to get from one to the other, you just have to know the hex code. So a much easier way to understand color is using HSL values. So HSL, it stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. Hue represented at the bottom bar there, it defines pure colors like red, green, magenta, pretty much all the colors of the rainbow, as you see there. Saturation is the x-axis on this picker and defines a range from gray, which is the far left, and the hue, which is on the far right. And you define the hue at the bottom. So if you change the hue at the bottom here, it will alter the color on the right, which is currently blue. And then finally, we have lightness. That's the y-axis in this picker, and it defines a range from white, which is at the top, to black at the very bottom. So if you wanted to use the most pure hue, the values would be defined something like this. Now, hue is measured in degrees, so it ranges from 0 to 360. Saturation and lightness are defined as a percentage. So if the color is fully saturated, it would be 100%. And on the y-axis, 100% lightness would be pure white and 0 would be pure black. So in order to get a pure hue, lightness would need to be 50%, as you see here. Now, even though HSL is supported on all modern browsers, the picker you see here does not actually exist. You might be more familiar with a picker that looks something like this, which is an HSB picker. Now, this is what you get in graphical editing tools like Sketch or Adobe products. And even Chrome's dev tools use this when defining HSL values. And the only difference is, which is a big one, is that the y-axis represents brightness instead of lightness. So what that means is that in this case, there's only one white value, which is in the top left corner instead of the entire top of the panel, like you see in the HSL picker. And as it gets more saturated and becomes more intense until it reaches a pure hue value in the top right of this panel. Okay, so when I define the brain color as an HSL value, it might look something like this. Now, I can't simply just add the hue value to this gray and hope that it will get blended. To do that, I need to increase the saturation. So here's what that would look like. So the top number is the current gray background color, and in the middle is my brand hue. And at the bottom, you can see that I've taken the brand hue and I saturated it only a bit, about 22%, as you can see there. And I kept the lightness to be the same value as the current gray. And this will just give it a nice hint of teal in the current dark gray header. So here's, I brought this up just so you can see the change. Here's the before and the after. So you may think it looks pretty subtle, but it just sort of makes it a little bit more interesting. Now, if you need some inspiration for choosing your own colors, try using Dribble's color picking tool. It limits the color choices, as you can see here, and provides some really good results. You can also filter the results to show the most popular shots, and it's great because all of the examples are in context of like a real app or just something a designer designed. So you can get some really nice results on there. Okay, so the next thing I want to take a look at is the input. Right now, it's looking a little too bright, sort of intense, so we want to tone that down a bit. I'm going to reduce the intense white by saturating it with a bit of the background. You can either do this by dropping the opacity like 10, 20%, or if you're like me, you'll handpick a color by eyeballing it until it looks about right. You don't want to make it too dark because you still want it to look clickable. And not only does this bring the intensity down, it makes it feel kind of glued to the header now, which is nice. And it also allows me to use white for a more distinguished focus state. And now I want to round the corners of this input, not only because it gives it a nice soft treatment, but I want to use a consistent corner radius. So as you can see here, I'm using a corner radius for all the other components like the panels and the buttons. By having a sharp edge on the input, it just makes things a little bit inconsistent. And you might be asking, well, why don't you remove the corner radius on all the other components? And it's because it sort of mimics the logo a little bit. And it's always nice to try and find ways to incorporate the brand identity into the UI bit, even if it's as subtle as this. So I'm gonna go ahead and apply that. Nothing too much, unless I'm going for like the full rounded look. I usually make my corners between like 4 and 6 pixels. Okay, now because I saturated all the other components a bit, I want to do the same thing with this search icon. Right now it's full black, so I want to lighten it a bit, just so it's the same, close to the same lightness as that placeholder text there. So I lightened it, it feels more balanced, and once again, I saturated it with a bit of the background colors so it feels more glued together. Okay, so right now I'm using Font Awesome for the icons. And Font Awesome, it's a great resource. It's been really widely adopted, and I get why. It's a huge collection of icons that are super easy to use. Now, if you're using an icon set like this, be mindful of the icons that have both an outline and a fill, and try to be consistent with what you're using everywhere else on the site. You want to avoid using multiple styles. I see this happening. Developers will often take icons from the Noun project, which is a site where you can grab a variety of different icons, and they'll try to find icons that fit all the needs for their website, but they get them from all these different sets, and it just looks messy. It's better to use one consistent icon set, because designers, they spend a lot of time on icons considering both like the weight and proportions to create a balanced and cohesive set, as you see here. Now, so I made a list of both free and available to purchase icons. I won't talk about each of these right now. I think they're all great sets. Each of them have their own personality, but it's also important to find a set that has all the necessary icons you need for your project. The last thing you want, like I said, is multiple styles scattered throughout your UI. So yeah, I won't talk about these all right now, but you can check them out later when I share these slides. So I'm going to use Heroicons for this particular UI. I designed and launched these about a month ago. I've been maintaining them quite a bit. I've updated them a few times. So you can grab those on my website. And so it just felt appropriate to use them for this talk. So I'm going to go ahead and replace the current ones. Here's the current ones. And there's the new ones. Okay, so now this top right corner, it's looking pretty tight up there. And because this profile picture is actually a drop down with some important links, I really want to draw more attention to it, as well as indicate that it's a drop down to provide some expectations. So I'm going to give this drop down an arrow just to fulfill those expectations, but I'm also going to surround it with a bit more space. Adding a bit of space is a really quick and easy way to draw attention to something, even as little as this. And I also put some borders around it so it doesn't look awkward. It just gives it some defined boundaries, as you see there. Now, it's looking cleaner, but one last change I'm going to apply is I'm going to make that profile picture a circle shape. Circles are great for profile pictures. They can make a bad photo look good, and they just look a little bit friendlier. So here's a bunch of examples from Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I think Facebook is now using circle, and they're just kind of on trend right now, which is, it's good to pay attention to that kind of stuff. So I'm going to apply that to the design. Here's the before and the after. Okay, so now that the profile picture's surrounding space pushed everything over just a bit, this once large gap that I had here, it now feels kind of like a narrow, it's an awkward narrow gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to evenly distribute those icons in that space. And because I toned down the input by saturating a bit with a bit of the background, I want to do the same thing with these icons for consistency. So that change is a bit hard to see. So I'm going to make a quick close-up of this section. So here's the before and the after. And this also makes it so we can now use white for the hover state, kind of like how we used white for the input on a focus state. Okay, so the top bar is looking pretty cleaned up. Let's just see what it looks like with the rest of the page. Okay, so I made a ton of changes here, but we've barely gotten started. So let's move on to the activity panel. Okay, so I already talked about changing the profile pictures to circles, so I'm going to do the same thing here. And the next thing I want to take a look at is the profile activity on the right here. Right now, because the important information, like the values, it sort of gets buried in there, and I want to bring them out a bit more. But first, I want to move that profile completion, that top item there, I want to move that label and value to be underneath the username here, as it just has more of a relationship with these items. The idea here is that having it underneath the username will ideally encourage users to click through to the profile, as it's only 40% complete here. And I also updated the language a bit, so it's acting less like a label and value, as you see here. And it's more using words like speaking to the user like a human. So when designing interfaces that show this sort of information, Structure things to emphasize the information itself, so it's easy to take in at a glance. Labels are important, but they shouldn't be competing with the values themselves. So, and a way to do that is to use font size to emphasize important information. So here are a few examples from Coinbase, Spotify, and MessageBird, where the label is de-emphasized with size, so the number stands out much more. Now, when you're going to introduce a number of different font sizes, like many elements of graphic design, it's always good practice to limit your choices. And one way to do that with type is by introducing a scale. Now, typographic scales have always been around in graphic design. If you took graphic design in school, they teach you all about this stuff. The example at the top here is a classic typographic scale, which is a harmonious progression of font sizes, often used in print design. And I generally stick to this scale, but I do with the exception of two numbers. First, I like to use a 20 pixel size font instead of 21 pixels. And that's just mostly my OCD. It's weird that we have like all these nice even numbers when we have an odd number right in the middle there. So I make that 20 pixels. And the other exception is that I like to add a 30 pixel font. Just because I always find myself reaching for something that's in between 24 and 36, and that just kind of fills that gap nicely. And anything beyond that, I'd work with multiples of 12. Now, to be honest, I'm not too strict on this. Font sizes are an example where you just need to use your eyes. But if you do want a starting point, this is a pretty good safe call. Okay, so for this design, I like what MessageBird did here, where they have 3 different rows in the pricing section. So I want to give this a similar treatment. So I give this 3 different font sizes to create kind of a clear hierarchy. And this makes it much more organized. But now my eyes, they're really drawn towards that large headline on the left here. Now, this is something I see often with Bootstrap sites. Developers will use an H1 tag for the sake of semantics and end up with a huge headline, which takes focus away from the other parts of the page. So I want to shrink that down a bit. So I want it to be just about the same size as the values on the right, so it just feels balanced. And it still manages to stand out. It stands out more actually, as it should, because it's next to the profile picture, which is really the focus of this panel here. Now, I want to tone down that welcome text a bit because it's really just supporting the username. And because we have this nice thing happening on the right with the 3 rows, I'm going to go ahead and give it that same treatment by making the welcome text the same size as the labels. And this just makes it so everything sits on the same row, sort of creating this nice scan line as you see here. Okay, so by making all these small changes, these valuable changes, I was able to free up all the space here. And I think this goes to show that making a whole bunch of little changes can lead to one big change, because now I can push all the information over on the right over here. And that results in all this extra space on the right side where I can now, it's now enabling me to move the sidebar up to be flush with the top. Okay, so there's a clear hierarchy being made here with font size alone. However, with all the text being the same color, it does look a bit busy. Plus, I also want this large text to stand out a bit more. So one way I can do that is making the other items stand back a bit. Excuse me while I take a drink of water. So I'm going to use color to create that hierarchy. Now, if you refer back to the previous examples where I use Coinbase, Spotify, MessageBird, they, along with font size, they also lighten the small text to be a bit, to just put a more emphasis on the values. Now, when you introduce different text colors to create a hierarchy, like font sizes, you want to limit your palette. I've seen some sites use like 50 shades of gray for their text colors. And this is just unnecessary and messy, especially for text. You can easily get away with using like 3 shades of gray. You can have a dark one for important information you want to pop, one that's a bit lighter for secondary information that's still easy to read, but it's easy to glance over when scanning the page, and another lighter one, but still legible for tertiary text. Now, this may include like metadata, or in the case here, the job title for the user. It's just de-emphasized a bit. Now, if you're using a framework like Tailwind, you can get away with using these 3 shades for your text colors. And if you're working with a darker background, you can go ahead and use these lighter colors just to get that inverted treatment. Okay, so I'm going to apply that to here's the before and the after. And this is pretty subtle change, so I did another close-up of this section. And so that's pretty subtle still, but it really makes those values stand out a bit more, which is nice. Okay, so one thing that still looks a bit off is there's an inconsistent values being used for the padding around this container. Much like type, it's also a good practice to limit your choices with space. So we're starting to see a pattern here, right? So one way we can introduce spacing scale is to reference your type scale. So you can probably get away with using about half as many values as you see here. Now, I'm using pixel units quite a bit in this talk for the sake of simplicity, but if you're using rem or m units, you may need to pull out a calculator and kind of figure out what the units are. Now, for this container, I'm going to use 20 pixel padding. So here's the before and the after. And that's just looking much more balanced. It just kind of holds everything together a bit better. And yeah, so now gamification, it's a pretty important aspect of this application, as well as many other social apps. It's really the only way to keep people engaged nowadays. So I really want this section to stand out more because it contains all those activity stats we see there. Unfortunately, it gets a bit lost compared to the rest of the design. So I really want to use color to draw attention. Using bold color is a really easy way to draw attention, as you can see here with Stripe's dashboard or Ghost, which is a publishing application. They use it on their pricing page. Now, at the beginning of the talk, I talked about incorporating the brand color into the top bar. And I only hesitated because I thought I could make better use of it for more important information on the page. And this one just seems a bit more fitting. So I'm going to apply that change by giving this a background. So there's what it looks like. Obviously, that looks stupid because we haven't changed the text color. So I'm going to go ahead and invert that. So that's looking better. And it definitely makes this section stand out more on the page. Now, earlier when I made the text lighter, I just made it gray to de-emphasize it, which makes sense on a white background because I really wanted to create the effect of reduced contrast. But making text the color closer to the background hue is what actually helps create the hierarchy, not making it a light gray. So what you want to do is saturate grays when using a colored background. So here's an example of what I was just explaining, how contrast works on a white background with gray text. But when you use the same treatment on a colored background, it ends up looking muddy and doesn't quite have the same contrast I'm looking for. So there's two other ways you can do this. One is by using white text and dropping the opacity bit, anywhere from 20 to 30% should suffice. Or if you're like me, you'll manually pick a color. And I like doing this just because it gives me a little more freedom. When I just lower the opacity, I'm simply changing the lightness. Whereas when I handpick a color, I can saturate it a bit. So let's go ahead and update that with the hue that's closer to the background. So once again, here's the before and the after. And as you can see, it just adds a bit of glow to the text. It feels less muddy looking on the background. Okay, so another small update I want to make is to make those growth profile completion numbers highlighted here. I want to make them white so they stand out a bit more, because they're helpful numbers, and it would just be nice to make them be a bit more scannable next to the labels they have there. So that's a pretty subtle change. It's almost hard to see. And I think this goes to show that even though those colors are accessible, they pass accessibility standards, I checked, they could be a bit more legible. So a quick way to do that without increasing the size is increase the weight. Okay, great. Now, the text is looking pretty clean, legible, and also has a nice contrast, but just to give it a little more pop, I'm gonna add a subtle drop shadow to it. So here's what it looks like without a drop shadow. And there it is after, and I made another close-up of this section because it's sort of difficult to see. So here's the before and the after. Okay, so this is looking much better, but we haven't really touched on this premium features promo area. So the first thing I want to do is give that text a nicer treatment. So what I did here is, just to give it some visual interest, is to emphasize that main benefit text a bit by making it bold and making the second point a bit lighter in color, just to make it stand back a bit. And I also want to change that blue link on the right. I want to change that blue link text to be the brand color, since the blue is looking a bit out of place on this. And I also made it bold so it stands out a bit more. Okay. And finally, I added an icon on the left just to bring a little more attention to it, make it look a little more inviting. Okay, so one thing that still feels off is the box shadow on this. Right now, it has an even spread around the entire panel. And offsetting box shadows, it's a really easy way to make them appear a bit more natural. So essentially when you have a box shadow with an even spread around the entire panel, you're not providing a light source. By offsetting it a few pixels down, you're adding a light source coming from the top. So here's the before and the after. Now that I've offset it a bit, it's more apparent that it's heavier than it needs to be. One mistake I often see developers make is exaggerating the shadow. It's like they just discovered the effect and their eyes haven't been trained to realize that it's too heavy. So I'm going to soften that a bit, bringing the opacity down to 8%. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that shadow to all the panels. So here's the before and the after. So let's move on to the newsfeed. Now, I know it may seem logical to touch on the new post section right now, but I'm going to come back to that shortly and you'll see why. So I'm just going to scroll down here. Now, I've made the profile pictures circles everywhere, so I'm going to make no exception here. And I also updated the icons. I went over that already, so I'm going to update that here. And finally, I'm going to give the containers some padding in the same way I've given the activity panel padding for consistency. Okay, now just those three changes, it's looking much better, but there's still a few things I want to reveal. So the first thing that stands out on this is all of those blue links, which also appear heavily on the sidebar here. So take it easy on the links. Here are a few examples from YouTube, Medium, and Airbnb, which are all link-heavy sites. They use a dark, bold text to emphasize those links, and this is much more legible, and it still manages to look clickable. So here's the before and the after. Now, even though this is much more legible, all of the type is kind of fighting for attention. There's no hierarchy being made here. It's making the entire newsfeed difficult to scan. Now, we've already discussed using color to create hierarchy. So I want to introduce 3 colors here. I really want that username to stand out because people are likely going to engage if they have a relationship with that individual. And I want the body copy to be easy to read, but easy to glance over when scanning the newsfeed. And I want to make that job title stand back of it as it's just supporting the username. Okay, now with all the font colors updated, those icons really jump out even though they share the same color as the text that are beside. And that's because the icons are heavier in weight than the text. So they're perceived to be a bit darker. So when working with icons that have heavier weight than text, make them a bit lighter so they feel more balanced next to the text. So good examples of that do this are sites like GitHub, Shopify, and Google Search. You can especially see it on Shopify where the icons are substantially lighter than the text because you really want that text to stand out and the icons just to support that. So I'm going to do the same thing here. So here's the before once again and the after. Now, I've already discussed updating the spacing and the container, so it's feeling a little bit more comfortable there, but I also want to consider the spacing for the text. You want to pick an appropriate line height. Now, unfortunately, there's no one size fits all because size and line length influence the line height. So for a small body copy text, a good safe call is 16 pixels with a 1.5 line height. And as you get to larger sizes, you just want to tighten that a bit to avoid heavy spacing between your lines. So because I'm using 16 pixels font here, I'm going to make the body font 1.5 line height. And that just gives it a little more room to breathe, making it more comfortable to read. Okay, so now this bottom section, it's taking up a lot of vertical space and making the bottom of the card look really heavy. It's taking away, focus from the post itself. Now, a common approach I see on sites like this, like Twitter, YouTube, and SoundCloud, they merge the actions and stats into a single row by making the action an icon and then putting the number beside it to indicate the user activity. So there's the before once again and the after. And that panel is still looking a bit bottom heavy because of the gray background taking focus away from the other items. And because we've merged the stats and the actions, we no longer need to play the role of dividing the content. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Okay, so that's looking much more cleaned up. Now, because the profile picture is included in the top section, it's creating this awkward alignment we see here. Aligning text is a quick way to clean up your site and make it look 10 times better. So this is especially true if you're working with a design like this, where you have either an icon or, in this case, a profile picture that's pushing all the items below it. So I'm going to push the body and icons to be over, just to be aligned with the username text. Okay, and that sort of creates an invisible guide and it becomes much more scannable. Okay, so just a little recap, as this is another really good example of how a bunch of small changes can lead to one big change, because now that we have font size, weight, and color doing all the heavy lifting to create the hierarchy, plus the alignment acting as this invisible guide, this top border is no longer needed to divide the content. And now that I've managed to make these panels clear of all the borders, I no longer need to keep each card separated. So, and it's still really clear what content belongs to what card, even though they all share borders. So even though I added all this extra space to make the card easier to read, I've actually managed to reduce the size of the vertical space by making all these other small changes. So, yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the new post section. So I've already updated the icons everywhere else, so I'm going to do the same thing here. And the first thing I want to acknowledge is that green button. I'll touch on the button on the right in a bit, but I wanted to show it here because this is a problem I often see with Bootstrap sites. It's important to give actions a hierarchy, but too often developers will use multiple button colors that serve their own semantic purpose. But what this totally does is disrupts the hierarchy. This example here illustrates the dangers of using semantics. Right now, that high severity button on the left, it almost stands up more than the two buttons on the right. And you certainly don't want users to deactivate their account. Instead of trying to use colors to create a hierarchy. So have a strong, bold color for your primary action. And this can usually be like your brand color. Something lighter for your secondary action. This could be like a white button, depending on the background you're on, or an outline as I've used here. And then use a text link for tertiary actions. Now, if possible, try to stick to just having one primary button on the page. Now, as you can see in this chart, you may need to give your actions a different style treatment depending on the surrounding UI. And depending on the page, different actions may have different roles. So sometimes it is okay to use a high severity button for the primary action. In this case, the red primary action is warning the user that they're about to deactivate their account. And this usually comes as a second step, like they click the button and then they get a modal like this, and then they need to confirm it. So I'm going to go ahead and match this button color to be match it with the brand color. Okay, great. So the next thing that's I want to take a look at is I want to attach a section to the newsfeed. Right now, that title, it's taking up a lot of vertical space. And it almost disconnects these two, even though they're directly associated with each other. Now, that's looking more compact, but I think we can do a better job. Now, Facebook and Twitter, these are both great examples of using progressive disclosure for the post section. Basically, what they do is they show a simplified, compact version for the input until the user focuses on the input, revealing additional options. Plus the submission button, it really has no value until you type something anyway. The one thing I like about Twitter's here is that they show the image icon in the collapsed version, just so the users can add an image right away without that second click. So I want to give this design a similar treatment by including both the video and the image icons in the input. Great. Now, that white input, it gets a bit lost in the white background. Not to mention, it gets kind of confused with all the surrounding borders. So one way we can treat that is by giving the input a background color and removing the borders so it just looks a little bit less busy. And much like the input at the top of the page, we can now make this input white with a darker border just for the focus state. And that might look something like this. Okay, so one last thing I want to do is remove that new post title. This placeholder text is sort of acting like a title itself. So if I remove the title, it's just kind of saving more vertical space. Okay, so that's looking much cleaner. And that wraps up the newsfeed section. So let's just see what it looks like with the rest of the page. So we're getting pretty close here. So let's just review the right sidebar. Okay, so before I do anything else, I want to make those pictures circles, as I've done with everywhere else. And I want to make the padding the same as everywhere else. And I want to update that text color so it has the same treatment as the users on the newsfeed. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. And that brings us up to speed. Now, the panel heading really draws me in there. It's really taking focus away from the rest of the page and some more important elements on the page. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that and invert the text color. But that title is also looking pretty large. So I'm going to reduce that for the same reasons I reduced the welcome text at the beginning of the talk. And when I do that, it still clearly acts as a title. There's definitely no confusion there. Okay, so the next thing that's drawing too much attention is that big view all button that we already talked about. On a scale of importance, I'd argue that this button would be much better served as a text link rather than a primary action on the page. And now that view all button, it's still taking up a lot of space. And it appears there's a lot of comfortable space up in that top right corner of this panel. So I'm going to go ahead and move it there. So that pushes things up nicely and by no means gets lost up in the top corner there. And next, those add buttons beside the users, they're pretty squished in there. And they're pretty much as small as they can get. Even the wording is questionable, but I'd hate to try and fit the word follow in there. So one thing you can do if you have an obvious action like this is replace it with an icon. And if you want to provide a little more clarity, you can always add a fancy tooltip. Now, the panel is looking pretty busy because of all the borders. And a cleaner way to divide content instead of using borders is to increase the spacing a bit. So for example, this example I used at the beginning of the talk, it really illustrates how it can clean up a design substantially, which just by removing the borders and giving it a bit more spacing. So I'm going to remove the borders here, and I'm going to increase the spacing a bit. So there's a little bit more room to breathe between each of the user groupings there. Okay, so we're nearly done here. We just have to review the navigation and then maybe some finishing touches. So let's move over to the navigation. So before I do anything else, I'm going to change those icons. Now, another thing that I've already gone over is the weight of the icons and how it makes them look darker than the text because they have a larger weight. Right now, both the text and the icons surprisingly share the same color, even though the icons look way darker. So I think this is a much better example than the previous example because it's on a white background. So that change is much more obvious. And like the right sidebar, the borders are making this look really busy. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those. And now in the sidebar, when I remove the borders, I increase the spacing a bit to divide the groupings. But because I'm working with single links here, I can actually tighten that space a bit. Okay. Now the panel I have behind this, the navigation here, these panels are great for making content pop off the page. But I want that navigation to stand back a bit because I really want to bring focus to the other components on the page, like the newsfeed and the sidebar. So I'm going to remove the panel from the navigation. And because I no longer have that container aligning with the logo, I shifted the navigation over a bit. So it's left aligned with that, the logo at the top of the page. Now, going back to my point about making the panel stand out a bit, right now they're doing a decent job on their own, but I want them to pop a bit more. And I also want to make that navigation stand back a bit. And a really easy way to do that is making the background a subtle off white. So here's the before and the after. Now that's a pretty subtle off white. I think it's like 2% darkness, but that small change makes a huge difference to make those panels pop. And it also brings up those subtle shadows a bit more, giving it a little bit of depth, which is nice. Okay, so back to the navigation. There's actually quite a few links here, and it's making it difficult to find things. Now, a common approach I see for heavy vertical navigation like this is to divide the links into logical groupings. So here are examples from Stripe's API guide and Spotify, where they divide the sections with increased spacing and giving each section its own title. So what I did here is sort of combine the links that are mostly associated with your profile at the top. I put the discovery links in the middle there, and the links that are mostly associated with the app, I put them at the bottom. And I separated them by giving them a bit of a bottom margin. So that helps a bit, but those titles, they're a bit large and they almost look like links themselves. So, and if you look closer at the examples that is shared, you'll notice a few things. First, those titles are smaller than the links and the color is much lighter. And that's because the titles are mostly there to divide the links to make them a bit more scannable, almost acting like labels. So you don't want them to stand up more than the links themselves. So, but they're also all uppercase just to make them feel more like titles. So I'm going to give this the same treatment. So there's what it looks like. Now, when you're working with all caps, Because uppercase letters don't have varied shapes like lowercase letters, it's always wise to give all caps a little bit of letter spacing, just to make them more legible. And this is generally a good rule when working with uppercase text in any situation, like even as little as an abbreviation in body copy. So here's the before and the after. And as a final step, I gave that home link an active state by making the icon the brand color and making the text a bit bolder and darker to make it stand out more. Okay, so that wraps up all the different sections here, but there's still a few finishing touches I want to apply. So one thing I try to do on most of the sites I design is saturate all the grays with a bit of color, sort of like I did with the header at the beginning instead of using a solid gray. So this would include all the text, the off-white backgrounds that I just went over, the icons and the borders, so like the borders in the newsfeed as you see here. Now, I don't want the saturation to be the same intensity for all grays. If I'm using an HSB picker, the saturation intensity might fall somewhere near this line that I've drawn here. And again, I'm showing an HSB picker instead of an HSL because this is what you get on graphical editing software in browser dev tools. If a HSL picker did exist, the curve might look something like this. So I'm going to apply that. So here's the before and the after. And what this sort of changes the temperature of the whole site and makes the elements feel a little more glued together. Now, here I saturated the site based off the hue of the brand color, but that doesn't necessarily always work for all colors. I find that when I try this with brand colors that are green or red, it doesn't quite have the same effect. But what I find does work nicely is changing the hue based on the temperature of the primary color. So for example, if I'm working with cooler colors like blue, purple, or green, I might saturate the grays with a bit of blue hue like you see here on the left. And if I'm working with warmer colors like red, yellow, or orange, I might saturate them a bit with a bit of like kind of a yellowy brown as you see here on the right. And I'd use a similar curve for each. It doesn't need to be dead on, just somewhere near that line. As it gets darker, it can probably get more and more saturated. Now, this technique is not guaranteed, but you can always give it a try. If it doesn't work, using grays is fine, but it's always worth experimenting with this sort of thing. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the font. I'm currently using Open Sans, which is a Google font. Open Sans is a really popular font with developers. It's a great font, but I just can't have a talk on visual design without addressing font choices. So in short, use good fonts. but seriously, like I said, Open Sans, it's a great font. It comes from Google Fonts, which is a great resource because it has a huge selection of free fonts. But with that, you have a lot to choose from. And most of the fonts on there are poor choices for UI. A lot of them are more ideal for like marketing sites because there's a lot of decorative fonts on there. So if you're going to use Google Fonts and just want something reliable, go to the sidebar and tweak the settings as you see here. Obviously, a sans serif because serifs don't really work well for UI applications. And select from the most popular ones. And I'd recommend a font with 8 weights. So you get like a regular, a bold, a lightweight, a semi-bold, plus all the italics that come with those. And this is going to give you a decent list of safe choices. Now, alternatively, if you do have a budget, I'd recommend using a service like Typekit or fonts.com or Heffler Fonts. Heffler Fonts is typography.com. These are all great services. They're all about the same price, about $10 a month. I think Heffler is a bit more, but those are primo fonts. And they have a much larger selection of high quality fonts. Now, Typekit has a similar panel to Google Fonts where you can customize the settings. What I have here is actually a good start when looking for a good UI font. But I also have a list of my own recommendations. So here are a few fonts that I've used quite a few times in the past. I think they're all great for UIs. They're all safe calls. Now, fonts are not necessarily transferable, meaning if you're using one font and decide to change it, you might need to adjust the size and weight a bit. For example, as you can see on the right here, Active and Museo, they're a bit larger. You can see how it wraps there. And I know Museo, the bold font, it's pretty heavy bold. So if you go from Museo to Proxima, you might need to adjust the weights a bit. Now for this design, I'm going to use Proxima Nova. This is a pretty popular font with designers. I just love the way it looks on screen. It's super legible. It's really versatile. It works with almost anything, and it just looks clean. So I'm going to apply that. Here's what it looks like with Open Sans. And there's Proxima Nova. Yeah, and that pretty much covers everything I wanted to go over. So one last thing. Let's look at where we started here. Okay, so we've come a long way. I'm going to let this scroll down here. And there's where we got. So I hope this shows how a whole bunch of little details can go a long way. And I hope you learn where you can look for inspiration and just some good tips that will clean up your design. Now, I know there's a lot to take in here. So I made this checklist of tips that I mentioned throughout the talk. So when the slides are available, you can come here and reference this when designing your own app. Everything is linkable on this page. Well, will be linkable. So each link will take you to where it was first used in the talk so you can see it in context and maybe apply that to your own design. Now, so if you enjoyed this talk, feel free to check out Refactoring UI. It's a project I'm working on with Adam. Adam is in the guy who spoke before me, Adam, where we take user-submitted designs and improve them in the same way I did in this with the example in this talk. And we share the results in the form of a case study. Now, we only have one case study out right now where we improve the design of Laravel.io. But Adam and I, we're working on the next one, and we hope to make that available soon. So check out the website. You can sign up there, and when the next case study is available, we'll send you an update to your inbox. So yeah, thanks.
All right, that was awesome.
Cool.
You got to do a lot of stuff there. Yeah, that's one I got to rewatch on video.
Yeah, that's why I made that little checklist at the end there. It's,
all right, a couple of questions that I thought would be good to go over. Well, I guess one, I'm sure a lot of people have this, like what design tools do you use? Like, is it just Sketch, or maybe you can give us just an idea of the kind of your core tool set?
Yeah, I use primarily Sketch. No, I 100% use Sketch. I used to use Adobe. I used it for years and years and years. And then when Sketch came out, I was a pretty early adopter. And when you go from Sketch back to like Photoshop, it's like learning how to juggle. It's Sketch has a really good user experience. Now there's all these like new apps coming out in the market now that Sketch has been so successful. Like I know Framer has one now. I know InVision is working on one that looks pretty promising. So I'm excited to check those out. But yeah, currently I use Sketch.
Okay. One more, and this is one I hit all the time myself. Like, what's your recommendation for when you're working on a project where you don't have, where like the default icon sets, every icon set kind of has the generic stuff like a user and whatever, Wi-Fi and that stuff, but you have other needs like medical or financial or, where it's more specialized, like,
yes,
but maybe you can't like, pay a designer to build you 200 icons. So what do you do in that case?
Well, I mean, I designed them, but
I guess you can just do it. If you're not you, what do you think?
But the list actually provided there. I'll go back to that slide. And again, I'll be sharing these slides afterwards. Am I sharing my screen still?
Yep.
Okay. So the icons I have here, these are pretty large sets, especially the ones that are available to purchase. I would just do the research ahead of time, make sure you have all the icons you need and ones that you can kind of expand out on. And with icons, I mean, you can kind of get creative with some of the metaphors and kind of, some of them can be multi-purpose, but I'd say start with the list I have here. Material icons from Google, they have a pretty vast collection of icons, and I need to update that link there. It has the wrong link, but especially the ones that are available to purchase here, they're pretty vast. They should have almost everything you need.
And would you be okay, to your designer's eye, are you okay mixing icon sets, or is that sacrilege, or what do you think?
Yeah, I spoke about that a bit in the talk. I think it's a bad idea to do that. It just kind of looks messy.
Right.
But yeah, reach out to me, and if you're using like Herocon's UI or Zondacon's and you need an icon, maybe I'll update those sets a bit.
Yeah, I like the Zondacons. I've used them myself. That's the Steve set, so definitely check that out. All right. Well, great talk. Thanks for having you on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.